When should men start thinking about testosterone health proactively?
We talk about that natural decline happening in about your 30s. Where were you in your 20s?
Testosterone has many implications in the body, cardiovascular risks and metabolic health. So it's kind of one of these things where what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Testosterone placement therapy stunts your body's ability to produce testosterone naturally. So if you start on TRT, you have to be on TRT for the rest of your life.
Many men right now are seeking out testosterone replacement therapy, which again, for many individuals may be the right thing to do. Unfortunately, they're getting treatment really in a silo.
And if you are someone who's also trying to conceive naturally, you also have to think about the fact that TRT affects your sperm count. And so there are other implications to being on TRT other than just the fact that it's like the Band-Aid solution.
I mean, when we think about what's driving testosterone, the first place I'm going to touch is muscle mass, right? And resistance training. Exercising is key.
Sleep is also very critical in maintaining testosterone levels.
The fact that a primary care doctor wouldn't test testosterone is like beyond me. Welcome to Get Well Better, a podcast by the Lanby. In each episode, we're going to dive into the nuances of the health and wellness industry, but all through the lens of patients. When I was 23 years old, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it made me aware of just how broken our healthcare system truly is. There was no coordination of care across my specialists. No one was talking to me about wellness and prevention, and there was definitely no hospitality. We've decided when building the Lanby that we wanted to be a true home base for health, sift through the noise of both the health and wellness industries, and help empower you to be your best advocate. And so in each episode, we're going to speak directly with specialists. We're going to ask them about the topics that need demystification and provide you with the resources to be the best possible version of yourself. Because at the heart of health lies proactivity, and knowledge is power. So let's embark on this journey to get well better together. I am so excited for this conversation today. We have Brandon, our wellness advisor, and Sylvia, Dr. Chudy, our lead physician, here today to talk about men's health. As many of you know, we've done a lot of amazing episodes about women's health, whether it be fertility, postpartum, general hormone health, and we have yet to do a deep dive on men's health. And funny enough, this is a surprise to many, but 50% of Lanby members are men. We do a lot around men's health when it comes to our members, and so we felt it was really important to give some sort of education around what men's health is. Like, what are the topics that people need to be focused on when they think about men's health? The other factor is that men are notoriously bad at going to the doctor. They consume so much less healthcare. And so when we do have the attention of men, we want to do everything we can to help empower and excite them about all the opportunities available to optimize their health. And so hopefully this is going to be an episode that leaves you with tactical tips to improve your performance, minimize risk of disease, but also just feel your best in a day-to-day and take control. So with that, I would love to start off by having you guys answer, what is men's health? Like, what do you guys think about when you think about, optimizing one of your male patients? And obviously age comes into play, but generally speaking, what are some of the big bucket items?
I think more selfishly speaking, as like the token male of the team, I really think about testosterone, right? You always think about muscle mass, testosterone. Secondly, I know cardiovascular is always an issue, thinking about cardiovascular risk and why that's more important for men than women, or potentially is. And then more thinking about friends and family and other men, like mental health is big, like seeking help, that kind of stuff, like men more likely to suppress their emotions. And finally, just generally speaking, just like metabolic health and tying that all together. Is there a difference between men and women?
Okay. So when you think about all of those buckets, is it that men are more likely to experience issues with obviously testosterone, but issues with metabolic health, issues with cardiovascular disease? Like, what are some of the stats that we should know about that might inspire men to take action?
I mean, from a cardiovascular disease framework, definitely when we're thinking about risk of heart disease, that happens earlier for men. And I'm sure we'll get into the nuances of that. And then just like the likelihood of results from that, so like hypertension and that kind of risk. So men see to have cardiovascular disease 10 years earlier. Men are 10 to 15% more likely to have hypertension. Otherwise, obviously, testosterone is kind of a weird one since men and women have totally different levels of testosterone and our hormones are in different places altogether. And then metabolically speaking, yeah, no statistics that are like hard hitting there, but definitely focusing on the cardiovascular perspective.
Okay. So let's start with testosterone health because obviously I think that's something that most men are interested in. It's less about weakness and more about performance when it comes to testosterone health. Like, how can I, you know, build more muscle? How can I be more cognitively focused? How can I, just be at the top of my game? So when you think about testosterone health, obviously there's a natural decline that takes place. When should men start thinking about testosterone health proactively? And are there signs that their testosterone is a concern before then? Like, what should people be looking out for?
Sure. So I think when it comes to the age at which men should start thinking about testosterone, it used to be that we thought that patients should land in the office when they're symptomatic. Not the case any longer, because I think right now we're in this age where if we start tracking things early enough, we can catch things earlier before they become problematic. So in my opinion, it would be nice to know what a man's testosterone level is at the age of 20 versus then what we're seeing a decade later, 2 decades later. So I think from that perspective, it would be great to have those statistics earlier on. But then when we look at what lands men in the doctor's office, it's usually those symptoms that we're talking about. So things like fatigue, things like low libido, poor sleep, poor energy, not being able to build muscle mass, weight gain, even depression sometimes. And sometimes men don't even realize that it's actually a result of having that low testosterone level, which is why they're feeling the way they are.
And you actually recently told me, which I was blown away by, that at a typical baseline physical, when you go to a normal, conventional medicine, primary care doctor, they don't test testosterone.
They don't. I've been in practice for a number of years, and traditionally speaking, I can say we do on an annual basis. We'll do a CBC, we'll do a metabolic panel, we'll check cholesterol levels, we'll check A1Cs, but we're really not thinking about testosterone on the forefront. And now being at the Lanby and for a number of years really, having that focus, it's incredible what we can do just knowing those numbers. And I think, we really do a deep dive, and we'll get into the specifics later because it's not only about total testosterone levels that are the drivers of, what kind of care we're giving patients.
And it's kind of annoying too, not getting that done earlier because, we talk about that natural decline happening in about your 30s. Where were you in your 20s, right? Am I in a good place now compared to where I was? Like, is this decline happening, but it's drastic? I'm going from 700 to 500 at 30, or was it slower? And so because you don't get that at a regular office, you really have no idea. Mm-hmm. And so we're not really testing. Maybe we're a little more inclined in your 30s, but unless you're showing those symptoms, we're not ever going to know. And so your baseline is probably far off from what it was prior to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, being able to have an established baseline is so, so important, which is why, when you talk about proactive health, it's making sure that even if you don't have a symptom to treat, that you're going to the doctor to establish that baseline, to know where you stand when you're at your best, when you feel good, so that when you don't feel good, you have that measurement of, okay, is this just like how I've always been, or is this what's contributing to these symptoms? So that's a really good point. And I'm curious, like, again, as someone who is also board certified in integrative medicine, how do you think about testosterone health as, a factor in other, elements of health, right? Like, I think so many people think about testosterone health and associate it with libido and muscle mass. But I don't think people think about it from the perspective of metabolic health or, any other function. So why is it so important to focus on testosterone health?
For a number of reasons, obviously, but I want to backtrack just for a moment. I also don't want to focus on numbers, right? So let's maybe for a moment backtrack and say what are normal testosterone levels? And what I want to highlight is that, yes, there is a range. If you get lab work done, you'll see testosterone levels, total testosterone levels in a range of, let's say, around 300 to 800, 1,000 as being a normal range. The reason why it's so important to have those levels checked earlier on in your 20s and your early 30s is because you might be someone that hovers in the 400 range and you feel great versus someone else that will hover in a 400 range and they will feel awful with that value. So knowing those numbers earlier on really allows us to know when it's time to intervene. And obviously we know testosterone has many implications in the body, not only for the reasons that we've mentioned with regards to symptoms, but there's also a connection with cardiovascular risks and metabolic health. So it's kind of one of these things where what came first, the chicken or the egg, because we'll get into this conversation of, how we can move the needle on things, and it'll be different for every individual depending on, what that root cause is. So the root cause might be that a low testosterone level got you to where you are versus these other comorbidities such as, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, obesity that got you to where you are with regards to, let's say, a lower testosterone level.
Right. So you don't know if it's the testosterone that's causing you to, for example, gain weight, or if it's the weight gain that's causing you to have the low testosterone.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then testosterone, like there's a lot of connections you can make. But if you took one example, if your testosterone is decreasing, and as a male, what that means is you're, again, more likely to put on fat, especially visceral fat, so around the waist, and lose muscle mass. Less muscle mass and more visceral fat actually leads to things like more insulin resistance, right? Which leads to more aromatase enzymes that lives in the adipose tissue. And what that does is converts testosterone to estrogen even more. And I say all this to say that all these things that are happening biochemically can lead to things like hypertension and high blood pressure because of what's going on. Your body loves homeostasis. And when you're seeing that drop in testosterone for a man, that's something our body doesn't want. And that's where the signs and symptoms or the connection to cardiovascular or metabolic disease can happen. So less muscle mass, you're no longer tolerating the oatmeal or the sweet potato like you did prior because of the insulin resistance, right? So it's loosely connected, but it's also directly connected. And yeah, still kind of like chicken or egg. And it's honestly both of them. And in the worst case scenario, they're driving each other down even more. They're just playing off of each other. It's a compounding effect if you're not taking advantage of optimizing your life. And so I think that 30-year-old marker, like where we see that natural decline, like that's a buzzword, but two things to think about is how can I optimize prior to natural decline, but also don't want to scare you. Just because your testosterone in your 30s is at a certain number doesn't mean it's going to go down. In fact, it can go up. And that's when we'll get into like more lifestyle things.
I wanted to take a quick pause to talk about my new favorite meal service. So I actually am someone who's pretty good at meal prep. I usually take about an hour every weekend to, think about all the vegetables that I need, the proteins that I want to prepare so that I can have lunch ready to go during the week. But sometimes, with 2 young kids, I don't have time to do that. And so that's when I rely on Sakara. They arrive on Sunday night. All of my meals for the week are prepared. Usually they send, breakfast and lunch. But sometimes if I want to just, only focus on lunch, I can do that because I usually have breakfast at home. And so what I love about Sakara is that it gives me all of the nutrients that I need, the fiber intake that I'm looking to hit. Obviously, plant diversity is big with Sakara. And so I just know that I'm gonna get all the high notes that I'm looking for in my meals throughout the week. But another fun fact is you also just get to be surprised and delighted by new, inspiring, plant-forward recipes, which again, should not be undervalued. Again, as someone who always cooks my own meals, it's nice to be, surprised by something new. If you're interested, head to sakara.com. We have a code THELANBY, THELANBY, for 20% off your first order. It's worth it. Just give it a shot and see how it makes you feel. I think that it's a great way to be efficient with your time and also hit all the high notes. So check it out.
How do you holistically assess someone when they're coming in with low testosterone? Like, what are some of the other data points that you look at, whether it's in their lab work or their lifestyle, their mental health, their work environment? Like, how do you create that assessment of a person, of a male?
Well, it has to do with everything that you just mentioned, right? And I think, what we're seeing across the health community, people are seeking this information out. And, let's say many men right now are seeking out testosterone replacement therapy, which again, for many individuals may be the right thing to do. Unfortunately, they're getting treatment really in a silo. And we're not looking at any of their other markers. We're not looking at their lifestyle habits. We're not focusing on mental health, their day to day. And so I think it's really important to grasp that concept that having medical providers really looking at the full picture is so critical because yes, anyone can go on TRT. What happens if, you go on TRT and you're not working out, you're not, maintaining good dietary habits, you're not getting good sleep, you're maybe drinking more. The TRT is sure going to make you feel a little bit better, but you're really not addressing everything and you're not getting any healthier. And I think that's really what we have to take into consideration when we seek these treatments out. I think, TRT is not appropriate for every man. It is for some, but I think you have to tackle it with all these components in mind. And so that's what we do. We do focus on, what their day-to-day lifestyle looks like. And then, of course, blood work, which is super important, which includes cardiovascular markers, which includes metabolic markers, nutritional panels, because we know that nutrients are also so critical to support testosterone production. So we have to look at everything combined.
And I think it's important to recognize, because I think most people don't know this, that testosterone replacement therapy stunts your body's ability to produce testosterone naturally. Correct. So if you start on TRT, you have to be on TRT for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. And if you are someone who's also trying to conceive naturally, you also have to think about the fact that TRT affects your sperm count.
Correct.
And so there are other implications to being on TRT other than just the fact that it's like the Band-Aid solution. So I'm curious, like, if you are someone who's trying to find the more holistic path, what are some of the lifestyle tips that you can give someone to boost that testosterone level naturally?
And don't take it for granted, because you can raise your testosterone up to about 40% naturally, right?
Wow.
And that could be the difference. Again, if we don't know your baseline and you're going up 100 points, that may take all the symptoms away for you.
And how long would something like that take?
That's all dependent, right? And so there's a lot of variables. But I mean, when we think about what's driving testosterone, the first place I'm going to touch is muscle mass, right? And resistance training. So exercising is key. You want to make sure that you're getting resistance training in at least 2 to 3 times per week. And it's very specific. Actually, 2.5 would be the actual number to use, because the way our body responds to exercise, about 48 to 72 hours after exercise, you're still in this positive protein balance. And so you can go 48 to 72 hours and still build muscle. As long as protein is in an adequate marker. But once you pass that, it's no longer sort of attenuating that. And now you're breaking down protein and not using it for muscle. So 2.5 times is the actual number, but who's working out 2.5 times? So I like to be on the other side of that, 3, and it could be more as long as you're not hurting yourself or overtraining.
So if you're working out 5 to 6, is that even better? Okay.
Even better, as long as you're doing the right things.
Okay.
This is where you would recommend a trainer and someone to look at stuff. And one of the best things we do at the Lanby is looking at your body composition. So we're tracking these changes in your muscle mass, right? And we're looking at your body fat composition. So we know maybe you're not training enough, or maybe you're overtraining. And you can do a whole 10-hour podcast on just training alone. But to leave it simple, resistance training, 2 to 3 times per week minimum. But all other types of training helps. Actually, high intensity interval training, you see transient levels in testosterone rise, which is beneficial for you as well.
What about cardio? Like
cardio too,
running?
like great, as long as you're not doing 2 things. You're not bringing yourself into a caloric deficit, which will drive testosterone down. And again, adding to that overtraining sort of position where you're just breaking down more than you are building.
So if you're running, making sure that you're not,
you got to eat.
You got to eat.
You got to eat if you're running. And you still need to prioritize that weight training.
Okay, so number 1 lifestyle tip is exercise, specifically if you can.
Yeah.
The resistance training. Number 2?
I would probably go with making sure that there's not a lot of visceral fat. right? Like the visceral fat, the fat around your waist, decreasing body fat is just as important as increasing that muscle mass. Because as I mentioned before, that body fat is really going to add to conversion of testosterone to estrogen.
So
And
how
that,
do you do that? How do you bring down your visceral fat? And I'm sure everyone wants to know the
yeah,
answers to this
well, I
question, not
mean,
just men.
again, that's a loaded question, but generally speaking, be active, right? So that you're at a caloric deficit, resistance train so that
Wait, but so here's the issue. Like if you can't be at a caloric deficit
no, you
for cardio,
yeah, you can, but just not at an aggressive pace. So weight loss should happen at 1 to 2 pounds per week, right? So you think about weight loss drugs, a hot topic, and people who are losing 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pounds and they're not resistance training, that's detrimental to testosterone. That's detrimental to your health.
right? Because it's bringing down your muscle
Mass more than
not
anything
just your
else.
fat, right?
So
Like
you
your muscle's the first one to go.
Exactly. So you can preserve that while still losing weight, right? So resistance training, focusing on complex carbohydrates, staying away from foods that spike your blood sugar like simple carbs, rice, bread, pasta. Alcohol is a big no-no for fat and for weight loss specifically. So I know we're all adults, but keep it to moderation. Try to have less, especially if you're specifically trying to lose weight. And then just highlight good real food. Like you can't go wrong eating real protein, real fruits, real vegetables, complex carbs. And
Specifically around protein, I know there's like the general rule of thumb of 1 gram of protein per pound. Would you say that as you hit, age 40 and you start to see a natural decline in muscle mass, that you should be doubling that up?
no, you wouldn't have to double your protein intake because again, even that 1 pound per protein per gram is on the aggressive side already. So, a 200-pound man having to eat 200 grams of protein, you don't need that much in order to help with the muscle protein synthesis. In fact, again, as I said, the more important factor there is the weight training itself. You don't want to go with some of the baseline recommendations, which is like across the board 56 grams for men, 46 grams for females. That's just too generic. It's not
Yeah.
individualized as much. But, I would say somewhere around that range is going to be perfect no matter what across the board throughout all your age.
And what does that look like in a day? Because I think people love to hear specifically, like, what does 180 grams of protein look like in a day?
Well, I mean, if you think about a deck of cards, it's kind of a common thing everyone can visualize. That's about 3 ounces of protein. And so a deck of cards of a fish or a chicken or a steak, somewhere around 7 grams. So quick math, 21 grams of protein in 3 ounces. I think especially men, since we're on that topic, are eating more than 3 ounces of protein.
For
in a
sure, I
serving.
eat 6 ounces
Probably
at least.
6 minimum. So you're already getting 41 grams in one meal. If you do that breakfast, lunch, and dinner, highlight 6 ounces of protein, you're 3/4 of the way there. If you're struggling, if you're a vegetarian, if you don't really eat that much, your appetite isn't that big, then you can utilize like protein shakes, especially whey protein, high protein snacks. So throw in some eggs, throw in some Greek yogurt, but it's really not that difficult to even hit the top end of it.
I think it's not difficult for lunch and dinner because people are used to eating animal protein.
Mhm.
Like whether it's chicken or fish, whatever it may be for those meals. But for breakfast, I find that people struggle the most because people don't realize how little protein
Yeah.
are in eggs.
Yeah.
Or, Greek yogurt is an amazing one.
Yeah.
But like combining maybe eggs and Greek yogurt.
Exactly. It's 2 eggs and a serving of Greek yogurt, you're getting 20 grams of protein. So that's not a bad start to your day, especially if you're going to make up the rest of the protein in snacks and your meals.
Yeah.
It's not that. And again, this is trying to hit that upper end, and we don't have to hit that upper end. So cut that in half, and you're still good.
Okay. I do try to do 1 gram per
Yeah.
pound.
It's good. And protein.
I would say I'm like 90% of the way there.
Protein's a little bit harder for our body to digest. When you're thinking about weight loss, it's one of those things that we know is not going to really spike blood sugar, which is good for weight loss. And we know that there's a little bit more of a thermic effect of food there. So we're burning a little bit calories when we're consuming protein as well. It makes it easier for that weight loss to be achieved. And it's very filling.
A lot of people ask me, why is blood sugar bad? Like, does that convert to fat and that's why it's bad? Like when you talk about body composition and avoiding blood sugar spikes, can you just explain briefly why there's such a concern around spiking?
Elevated blood sugar just causes inflammation, right? And when your body's inflamed, that is going to lead to all the cascades of events that can lead to things like high blood pressure, more weight, all the risk for cardiovascular disease. And so when you're eating something that has higher sugar amounts, right, you start to crave it more, so you end up having more. you start to develop things like leptin resistance and insulin resistance. So now you're more hungry, you're not able to sort of tolerate the sugar the same way, so it's more inflammatory. Your body's metabolism is actually slowing down. You're putting on more fat. So this is compounded and confounded to the point where you get to the place where you're no longer able to sort of get rid of the inflammation on a cellular level like you were on a baseline, and now you're damaging the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is the powerhouse of that cell. And so when the powerhouse isn't working, no matter where that cell's located, that cell's not working. And so you think about cognitive health. Powerhouse in the brain cells aren't working, you have cognitive like fatigue and decline. The powerhouse in the heart's not working, you're having hypertension. And so it's this cascade of events, and unfortunately, the deeper you're in, that compounding effect does make it harder. It's like an uphill battle. And so you really want to control that blood sugar and make sure metabolic health is pristine, because when that's pristine, everything else comes with it. It flows really nicely.
Okay, that's very helpful. I'm sure everyone appreciated the little dictionary side
We have to look up a lot of words.
No,
today.
it is. It's good. I do think that people like to understand the science, because that helps them like really validate that this is important. But anyway, so okay, we did 1 is muscle mass, 2 is protein and trying to minimize visceral fat. 3, would you say, would be stress, sleep? What would it be?
Both. I mean, again, kind of painting this holistic picture, all of it is important. Sleep is also very critical in maintaining testosterone levels. Interestingly, there have also been studies as to when in the nighttime it's more critical to have more quality sleep. And interestingly enough, it's the latter half of the of the night. But sleep is also extremely important.
With sleep, should you be getting more than 7 hours, or 7? Is 7 the minimum? Is 8 the minimum?
I'm okay with 6, but truly speaking, everyone should be hitting 7 to 9. But if you're functioning on 6 and we're looking at everything else and testosterone isn't declining and all these things, I think 6 is functional. But if we're looking at optimal, 7 to 9. And testosterone production happens at night. And so when you're not getting that good sleep, that's going to be an issue, which is with the aging male. And I have to keep reminding myself as an aging male, unfortunately, sleep can get disturbed easier and easier as you get older, right? Circadian rhythm is thrown off. So you're kind of like waking up earlier at different times.
Yeah.
Melatonin production decreases. So naturally you're just less sleepy.
Yeah.
And so you have to do things to make an effort to make sure your sleep quality stays up, because it is naturally declining as well.
Okay, so what can you do to increase your sleep quality? Because like my dad, for example, he'll try so hard to sleep past 5:30, but he can't.
You might have to go to bed earlier.
Okay, so
some people will
really
wake up
just a matter
earlier.
of like that's the time you're waking up, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you can't go to sleep earlier.
You might be able to go to sleep earlier. Exercise is so important in helping you be able to fall asleep. So if someone's sedentary, start exercising, I guarantee they'll have better sleep patterns. And then just consistency with your routine, right? Like sticking to good habits, not bringing your phone into the bedroom, keeping the temperature cold, a dark room, like
TV
not
before bed. Is a
yeah,
no-no?
especially probably a no-no, especially if it's in bed, but something that's so captivating. Like if you're watching a horror film, if your heart is pumping a bit, you're not going to fall asleep that easily. So really just making sure that sleep hygiene is important, right? Because you are having like the card stacked against you.
And I think the stress piece is so interesting because like we all live in New York City where we're just used to being stressed. It's like almost our new state of normal. So how does one actually have that self-awareness of, okay, no, I'm actually stressed and now it's affecting my health? Are there signs that you're stressed? And maybe like pointing to blood work, like what do people look for in their blood work? I know testosterone health is not something that's being tested. So is cortisol something that you would, recommend everyone get tested?
Cortisol, I would say, I think we have to personalize it to the individual. I think in certain instances, knowing what your cortisol levels are doing throughout the day is definitely important and sometimes informative for some individuals, because sometimes people don't think that they're stressed. Or living in New York City, a lot of times we kind of drown out everything around us, and then we go, upstate to the countryside, and all of a sudden we're like, oh my goodness, this is actually stressful for us. So I don't think we realize that enough, but I think we have to look at the full picture. I think, one of the things that we always say, and I'll, take it back to one of our colleagues in the office where, we look at men coming into the office, and if their testosterone level is 500 and we know that they work and live in New York City, we're like, we'll take it, depending, of course, on their symptoms as well. So we have to, take that into consideration, but it's not a one size fits all for everyone. And I think, when we have someone coming into the office, we have to first address like the low hanging fruit, because sometimes it is about, well, you're going out every night and socializing and having multiple drinks. So that's affecting your sleep quality. That's affecting your liver function. And then, if that's affecting your liver function, you're going to be, let's say, producing more sex hormone binding globulin, which will bind to the free testosterone. So there's definitely a cascade of events that can occur, but it's really just figuring out what it is for the individual that we can really tackle.
Mm-hmm.
And cortisol is a buzzword, but it's not all bad, right? Like we need cortisol.
Can you just briefly say what cortisol is? Because I threw that in there, but I think a lot of people have never heard what.
I mean, it's just a hormone, and we call it the stress hormone because it kind of puts us in a state of like fight and flight, right? And so when you're stressed out, that's why it raises. So as a hormone that is useful in a sense, like, I mean, the old thing that you always hear is like, if there was a lion in the jungle and 100,000 years ago, cortisol is what allows you to run away, right? Like it heightens it up, it stresses you in that moment and you can react, right? We need cortisol. But chronically elevated cortisol is when we see the issue, especially when it comes to the testosterone. Because chronically elevated cortisol does everything we kind of mentioned in those cascades previously, causing that inflammation and directly suppressing the way your body responds to the hormones that produce testosterone, right? So like the hormones in your pituitary gland in your brain, like luteinizing hormones. So chronically elevated cortisol is bad. Cortisol on its own is not bad. We need it, or else we couldn't do this podcast today. We wouldn't be ready enough to go.
So I think what's so interesting about the conversation of men's health and women's health is this one point on cortisol, because when you now talk about intermittent fasting in the scope of women's health, the consensus is it's really bad for women. It's especially bad because, you end up with higher levels of cortisol because you're stressed, because you're hungry, your body can't handle it. And when your cortisol levels are high, that means that your production of sex hormones is low. So why isn't that the case with men? Like I would love for you to explain like why intermittent fasting is actually good for men, and would you say that that's a lifestyle tip that you would recommend for most of your male patients?
Yeah, so just like many ways, like when we talk about cardiovascular health and estrogen being protective for women, in the setting of intermittent fasting, testosterone is protective for men. So because of high testosterone, when we're intermittent fasting, we actually are producing more testosterone. We're producing other hormones like growth hormone, right? Which is going to preserve muscle mass, right? We're also going to have less insulin sensitivity. So women are going to have more insulin resistance, and we're going to have more insulin sensitivity. So basically what that means is we're going to react to blood sugar differently. Women will crash more often, right? So that fatigue, it's really, really hard hitting for women compared to men because of testosterone being protective. Other things like muscle mass being protective as well. Muscle has a lot of glycogen, stored sugar. And so we can tap into that, and we can tap into our fat reserves a little bit more easy compared to a female who really does well on glucose when it comes to exercise. And so when you're intermittent fasting, you have no glucose there. So there's a bunch of reasons why it's protective for men and a little more detrimental for women. But to some degree, two things you can think about is intermittent fasting does not have to be in the morning. And that's sort of when we see those effects, because an empty stomach and exercising and all those things are compoundedly more detrimental to women. And the other thing is like where in your phase and your cycle you are can be something to think about as well. So a little bit early on in day like 1 through 14 for women, you can deal with the intermittent fasting better because estrogen is still in a protective place and there's no progesterone. But when you get to the second half past ovulation and progesterone is really, really high and estrogen is now crashing, that's when you see like the mood, the fatigue, the hunger. And so like now you're not doing great. So you can play with it depending on where you are, but at the end of the day, men just do have a better response, and it's really mostly due to testosterone.
Okay. Okay. So that brings me to the metabolic health piece, because I know that that's like the next big bucket. What's the relationship between testosterone health and metabolic health? Like we talked a little bit about how sometimes it's a chicken or egg. Like you don't know if you've gained weight because your testosterone is low or if it's the reverse. So why are they so interconnected? Or how are they so interconnected?
I think it's just like cellular degradation, right? So metabolic health, again, just kind of just beats up your cells if you're not taking care of it. And so when you're seeing a decline in cellular health, that's going to lead to a decline again into all of the aspects that help you function as a human. And in this case, the testes aren't getting the nutrients it needs because there's constriction in your blood vessels because of all of this elevated blood sugar, right? So like you're more likely to have hypertension because cardiovascular health is working as well. And because you have more hypertension, then the nutrients aren't going to the testes. Now you're producing less testosterone. So there's a lot of like segues there that are kind of like nerdy and geeked out, but it's really, when it comes to metabolic health, I think it's mostly due to cellular health outside of like muscle mass and that kind of stuff.
And we do also know that there is a correlation that we can see where if someone is working to get their testosterone levels higher, we will see a decrease in insulin resistance. We're going to see that decrease in weight. And then, of course, coming with that is that decrease in cholesterol levels, decrease in high blood pressure. So there is definitely a correlation.
I'm sure that a lot of men who are trying to lose weight and struggle because they have low testosterone, or like, can you just then prescribe a weight loss drug, whether it's Ozempic or Wegovy? Like, what's your stance on sort of, instead of TRT, using a weight loss drug? Like, how does that work in parallel?
Sure. And again, it's personalized to the individual. For some individuals, TRT will be more appropriate, also depending on where they are in their lives, whether or not they're going to have children. I think weight loss medications are very valuable. I think, we have to take a look at the individual and where they are. If, foundationally, we're always going to think of lifestyle first, and lifestyle in conjunction with a weight loss medication. But if, let's say, we're not seeing the results that we want to be seeing with weight loss, then yes, 100% weight loss medications can be very effective. And of course, they will, if they're doing all the appropriate things with regards to their lifestyle, we will see an increase in testosterone. That's another way of tackling the testosterone issue.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So now the cardiovascular piece, because I know that when it comes to lab work, the way that we sort of think about our buckets, and I'd love for you to talk more about this, but like we have our hormone health panel, we have our metabolic health panel, our nutrient panel, and then our cardiovascular. Like where are we sort of doing a deeper dive on cardiovascular health, and why? And how does that affect men's health?
So, I mean, some labs, I mean, you're always going to see in your yearly physical, right, the HDL, the LDL, and the cholesterol, which are good, right? Can kind of give you an idea of where you're at. But I know when we're working together and we're looking at a little bit deeper dive, we're looking at things like ApoB and LPA, right? And so these are lipoproteins that give us a little bit more insight. And so, for example, LPA is sort of the genetic risk, right? And the genetic risk to more of the plaque forming sort of like consequence to where you're at. And so now we know, again, that's not something modifiable. So if you have a high LPA, there's nothing you can do, but it gives us insight. And maybe, the clinician is going to make a different decision based on your LPA if your levels were a little bit higher, but your LPA is high. So there's risk there. So now we have more ideas of what's next step. And ApoB is similar. So LDL looks at the cholesterol, right? So it's the lipoprotein that is LDL is attached to cholesterol, and we get a calculated cholesterol number. But the ApoB is looking at the particles themselves, and that again is also an indicator of plaque buildup. So when we're looking at ApoB, we're getting a better understanding of your risk for like atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. So I think it helps us shape what the traditional panel will look like.
Are there connections that you guys look for between all these different panels? Like, how do you typically connect the dots when it comes to, especially metabolic health and cardiovascular health?
Cardiovascular and metabolic health are like very, very closely intertwined, because many a times if we see abnormalities in the cardiovascular panel, we know without even looking, we're going to see abnormalities in the metabolic panel. And when we say metabolic panel, we're thinking about things like A1C levels, we're thinking about insulin levels as well. This kind of goes back to that lifestyle piece. When someone is not eating a proper diet, they're not exercising, they're consuming alcohol in excess, they're not sleeping well, we're going to see these changes. So it's heavily intertwined. The good thing about it is that, we're not going to prescribe anything different for either. We're not going to say, well, here's, a dietary lifestyle prescription for your cardiovascular health versus your metabolic, because it's all intertwined.
Mm-hmm. From like a proactive standpoint, if you were to, you have like a 35-year-old patient, their family history. So maybe they're prone to certain types of disease, whether it's cardiovascular, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's, diabetes. Like, what are the screenings that you recommend beyond this comprehensive set of labs that people should do, whether it's on an annual basis or more frequently than that? Like, how can men stay more proactive about their health? And then obviously there's the lifestyle piece, which I'm sure is like the most important thing you can do. But are there other like suggestions that you guys have that men typically ignore? Because again, going back to the earlier point, they're notoriously bad at going to the doctor.
We do a very comprehensive blood work panel from the get-go, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other biomarkers that we can be checking. Blood work shows that their cholesterol levels are elevated. Of course, we're going to then go beyond and make sure that we've gotten an ApoB, make sure we've gotten an LPA level, checking their high sensitivity CRP level. Perhaps then that individual if it's necessary to explore further what their, cardiovascular health is like, and getting something like a calcium score. It really kind of all depends on what we're seeing from that initial evaluation. And then not to mention bringing it back. A 35-year-old male, yes, of course we want to be checking testosterone levels as well. With regards to screenings, that really boils down to, what is their personal health history? What is their family history? Because sometimes we want to be proactive in screening for things even earlier. So, obviously when we think about things like colon cancer, which there is a huge risk for men and women, unfortunately, there's been a rise in colon cancer incidence globally last decade or two. And so we want to assess their colon cancer risk. And then we think about prostate health, which perhaps maybe not something that we think about in a 35-year-old, but we start looking at that into the 40s, and then depending on family health as well.
Mental health, as I kind of mentioned in the beginning a bit, we do screenings and we use like audited questionnaires to find out where they're at, to find out about anxiety and depression. And I think that's such an important topic because men notoriously suppress all those things, right? But personally, I think, or at least from seeing like patient demographics and over the years, I think they're a little bit more open to those screenings, and then they actually answer. And half the time, then we can say, okay, well, do you have a mental health provider? And probably half the time it's no, but a lot of times at that point they are receptive to it because obviously we're asking for a reason. And so like mental health with men is something that we can really look into a bit more as well. So I think that's also definitely part of that screening process because mental health and anxiety, depression, that's all tied to testosterone, to stress and inflammation, which is, you can go full circle with that as well and how it impacts your health overall.
And then not to mention fertility as well, right? A 35-year-old male, many a times we think about fertility as affecting only women when it's 50-50 really. And so we want to also make sure that we're being proactive about that. And if it entails getting, a sperm analysis, obviously working on getting their testosterone levels to a better place, that's what we're going to focus on as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause from our episode to talk about Just the Labs by the Lanby. This is a new product that we launched with the effort of trying to personalize your approach to wellness. So are you someone who's been struggling to lose weight or maybe maintain energy throughout the day? Have you heard about hormone imbalances and think that that might be something that's wrong with your health? And maybe you're just feeling off, but you actually can't pinpoint what's wrong. And then what happens when your doctor dismisses those symptoms because your labs look absolutely normal. So the reason they look normal is because your doctors are measuring only about 20 biomarkers, and they're referencing ranges that are based on where 90% of the US population fall, as opposed to what's considered optimal health. So that's the first problem. Now, the other problem is that these doctors aren't trained in functional medicine, and so they can't connect the dots and dig deep into what could be the root cause of your issues. So now we offer Just the Labs to be able to give you that experience so that you can test those 100 biomarkers, but then also receive that consultation to understand what they mean. So you'll see what your deficiencies are, you'll get tailored recommendations to address them, and you'll start to actually see progress in your health. So take a look at Just the Labs, our new product by the Lanby, and don't waste another day guessing your way through your health. thelanby.com/justthelabs for more info and to sign up. And you can also follow along at the Lanby on Instagram.
What do you see as like the most common concerns that our members have? Like what's been like a popular topic? Is it testosterone health, or is it
Yeah, I would throw in cognitive health and gut health as like top concerns as well. And we can relate those back to. But yeah, I think cognitive health, gut health, and those are probably two big ones.
And I think cardiovascular for sure, because I think we do have a good number of individuals, men, that come in with a very strong family history of cardiovascular health
Yeah.
or risk.
The reason why we're looking at all these other markers, the reason why we're not just throwing TRT in a silo is because it depends. And so we want to look at everything and it crosses every boundary, all these things we talked about today. And you want to make sure you're looking at each patient really as an individual. So you do have to look at everything to understand one thing, which is pretty crazy. And I'm glad we do it because we catch things in different capacities.
I mean, the fact that a primary care doctor wouldn't test testosterone is like beyond me. But like, even if you look at the number of biomarkers that we test relative to, a general practitioner, it's, I think, 5 times the number. And there's a rhyme and reason for every single test that we've included in that panel. So it's, I do hope that with more testing, with more curiosity, I think that will start to inspire, more action. And I think that the like marketing around TRT has been phenomenal in that it's gotten more and more men aware of things like brain health, things like, their ability to build muscle quickly, whatever it might be. There's also the factor of our environment has caused a decline in testosterone in a way that like I don't think we saw 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's partly the fact that we're just not eating well, that we're under so much stress, and that we're also exposed to so many endocrine disruptors.
Yeah.
And I feel like women talk a lot about endocrine disruptors because of fertility, because that's when they see it most present. But really it's for men, like even when you're not thinking about starting a family and you see that your testosterone levels are lower than they should be and you have no idea why, oftentimes it's like the products that you use. And that's crazy.
I mean, the water, the air, the cleaning products, the face products, right? The food that we're eating, the processed foods, the pesticides, all of that. And even when the food is at its best, they're still depleted compared to what it was 100 years ago because of the soil depletion, right? So all of this can add up to just basically for men, and in this situation, more estrogen, which equals less testosterone. And so sometimes it is these external forces, unfortunately, that we're faced with, but not to say that there's not a lot you can do with lifestyle, diet, and those are still top tier unless there's a root cause, like there's something else going on that's causing the low testosterone that's not related to lifestyle, then that has to be taken care of course. But you're dealing with even just the sedentary lifestyle in work, right? I mean, we're sitting more behind a computer, we're walking less, we're working from home. We don't even do the commute that we used to do 5-6 years ago on a day-to-day. We cut out the 20 minutes of exercise some of us were only getting. That's wild. That makes a big difference. And I will die on the sword of exercise because it's so key. Obviously, diet is a dietitian, but exercise is up there.
Okay, so the last question I'm going to ask is like, if there's one tip, and maybe it's like, take this supplement. So like whatever tip you want, but like if there's one tip that you want people to like leave this conversation with, and then one habit you wish that they would get rid of, what would it be?
It's a good question.
I will start with the one habit they should get rid of. We're seeing more and more evidence about what alcohol does. And I think we don't stress that enough, also in the context of male health, for many reasons.
Can we just talk about this briefly? How do you compare the impact of alcohol relative to marijuana and, drugs like mushrooms?
Unfortunately, we don't have that evidence, right? Because of the fact that we haven't been able to study all the effects of marijuana. And then not to mention, we think about things like vaping and whatnot. So we don't have that information. I think, we'll be able to gather more information as the years go on. But with alcohol, we're continuing to gather information. We're continuing to gather, in fact, like very negative information about what alcohol does to our bodies. So I think, in the context of what men focus on, be it keeping good testosterone levels, maintaining cognitive function, making sure that your liver health is good, metabolic health, it's one of those things that, we should definitely lessen the consumption of.
I mean, I can ask you a question and I can say, name a positive to THC or microdosing psilocybin. Can you name one? You can, right? I would think you can.
Other than feeling good?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I guess I messed this one up. But there are positives, right? Whether it's
What are
like
the
stress
positives?
relief, right? That could be part
But
of
can't you
it.
say the same thing
Appetite.
about alcohol?
No. Alcohol, there's only negatives.
What do you
There's
mean?
only
It
negatives.
relaxes people. It makes
Doesn't
people
though.
feel more
It
social.
doesn't. It may be like inhibition in a setting of like that kind of thing. You're controlling what you're willing to do. You're more social, but you're directly impacting fat metabolism, which is directly impacting weight, blood sugar, testosterone. Like alcohol is a poison.
Yeah, that's literally my argument. Because
Alcohol
when
is a
people
poison.
ask me this, I'm like, I would rather choose something that's not a poison than choose alcohol. Like alcohol is definitively a toxin in your body.
There's studies in the VA community where like psilocybin can have a great effect for cognitive repairment and PTSD, right? So there's positive things to these natural things. Alcohol, unfortunately, I can't think of a way to say like this is, and they tried, which was like, the one glass of wine and how, in
Right.
moderation. No, that's actually the statistic specifically is if you are an alcohol drinker and you're a 50-year-old white male, it can have a small effect. Everyone else, or if you've never drank alcohol before, it has a negative effect.
Wow.
So I can't name a positive for alcohol. So yeah, you stole my habit because alcohol
it's truly like
is
a
number
vice
one.
that you just enjoy.
number one. Yeah. If I had to pick a actionable item, I mean, I'm the wellness advisor, so I can't just pick one, but it is that combination. It's just like, don't take for granted the lifestyle part of it, right? So the effect that you can have with good solid sleep, 7 to 9 hours, resistance training 2 to 3 days per week, eating a healthy diet, right? Like focusing on real foods, getting rid of junk, processed foods, and alcohol, and just dealing with stress better, having mechanisms to cope, thinking about mental health, thinking about yoga and breathing techniques.
I know
and
the
all that
problem
kind of
is
stuff.
though that like I feel like whenever people talk about wellness, they just get overwhelmed by like all the different buckets of things that they have to
Exercise.
do. So you got to just pick one.
Exercise.
Exercise.
Exercise for brain health.
Just
Exercise
go
for
get
testosterone.
yourself some weights.
Go get some weights.
Heavy
Go outside
weights.
for a walk. You don't even need weights. Go outside, find some scaffolding, do some pull-ups, find a bench, do some dips, and go on a walk in the sun. Perfect for you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys so much. This was incredibly informative. I really do believe that men are starting to take more control over their health, whether it be for the reasons of prevention or just because they want to feel, like they're the most optimal they can be. So whatever the incentive is, I do see men taking more action. I mean, we see it here at the Lanby all the time. And so it's energizing to hear like what action can be taken. And so I hope that we can sort of all be more proactive about talking about these things collectively, because it's these conversations that start to ignite that motivation and that incentive in people's minds of, okay, here's how I can sort of do more. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Couldn't have said it better.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Get Well Better. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date. Follow along at The Lanby on social media and visit us online at thelanby.com. You can also schedule a 15-minute consultation.